For 10,000 years, they told us the Emperor was watching. That he held the Imperium together with his will alone. But what if I told you he is not enduring at all? That the Golden Throne is not a sanctuary, but a feeding machine. That every day 1,000 souls are burned just to keep him from collapsing completely. This is not a story about faith. It is about what happens when you learn the cost of survival and realize you were never supposed to know. I received the summons on a morning when the sky above MacGregor's secondary archive complex burned the color of old parchment. The vellum seal bore marks I had only seen in historical records, symbols that predated the current High Lords by millennia, and beneath the ornate calligraphy lay a simple directive that made my hands tremble as I held it. Report to Terra within the month. Bring nothing. Tell no one. The Inquisition had work for me, work that required discretion and a particular expertise in pre-heresy documentation. And though I had spent 15 years cataloging the forgotten margins of imperial history, I had never imagined my name would surface in such circles. Marvian Hale, Junior Archivist, Specialist in Administrative Records from the Unification Wars. A man whose greatest achievement was reconstructing supply chain manifests from the Siege of Terror using water-damaged fragments and educated guesswork. I was not a warrior. I was not a saint. I was simply someone who understood how empires kept their paperwork. How truth hid in ledgers and requisition forms. How the past whispered through bureaucracy when grander narratives fell silent. The journey to Terra took 6 weeks aboard a cramped transport that smelled of recycled air and human anxiety. I shared quarters with a dozen other passengers, none of whom spoke much, all of whom carried the same haunted expression of people summoned to the throne world for reasons they did not fully understand. We passed through the warp in silence, and I spent my days reviewing what little I knew about inquisitorial protocols, trying to imagine what kind of archive work could require such secrecy. At night, I dreamed of documents burning, of endless corridors filled with scrolls that turned to ash as I reached for them, and I woke each time with the taste of smoke in my mouth, though the air filtration systems kept our quarters pristine. When we finally emerged into real space and terror filled the viewports like a scarred gray jewel wrapped in orbital fortresses and defense platforms, I felt something close to religious terror settle into my chest. This was the heart of everything. The place where humanity's last hope sat enthroned in golden agony. The truth was closer than I imagined. They brought me down through layers of security that made my credentials seem laughable. Scanners and gene locks and servo skull verification at every checkpoint until I stood in an antechamber deep beneath the palace itself in a section of the catacombs I could not locate on any map. The Inquisitor who met me there introduced herself as Vestra Collini, a woman whose augment eye glowed with a soft amber light and whose voice carried the clipped efficiency of someone who had long ago abandoned pleasantries. She told me I had been selected for a task of utmost importance, a project that touched upon the very foundations of the Imperium, and that my work over the next months would be classified at the highest levels. When I asked what exactly I would be analyzing, she gestured toward a door behind her, a massive slab of adamantium inscribed with warnings in 17 languages, and told me I would understand soon enough. The door opened with a hiss of ancient pneumatics, revealing a chamber beyond that stretched into darkness. And as I stepped forward, I caught the scent of something I could not name, something that reminded me of ozone and burnt flesh, and the peculiar metallic tang that clings to very old blood. The archive they showed me was unlike anything I had encountered in my career. The chamber extended far beyond what the initial doorway suggested, a vast space supported by columns of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And along every wall rose shelves stacked with data cores, parchment scrolls, crystalline memory matrices, and devices I did not recognize. Everything was labeled in the cryptic short orth hand of the administratum's most secretive branches. Catalog numbers that meant nothing to me. And when I asked Kalina where to begin, she handed me a slate containing a list of specific documents I was to locate and decrypt. The first item on the list made my breath catch. Mechanica's Technical Schematic Theta 91, Primary Life Support Apparatus, Golden Throne, Layer 7 through 42. I looked up at her, searching for some indication that this was a test or a mistake, but her expression remained neutral. She told me the Inquisition required a comprehensive analysis of certain systems within the throne's infrastructure, systems that had been deemed too sensitive for standard review, and that my background in administrative archaeology made me uniquely suited to the task. She did not explain why such analysis was necessary now, after 10,000 years of relative stability. I began my work that afternoon, pulling data cores from their climate-controlled housing and interfacing them with the coitator terminal they had provided. The first schematic I decrypted showed a cross-section of the Golden Throne's lower mechanisms, layers upon layers of machinery that descended into Terra's crust like roots seeking water. And as I traced the conduit pathways and power distribution networks, I noticed annotations in the margins, handwritten notes in a language I recognized as Proto-Gothic mixed with Mechanicus binary count. The notes described flow rates and energy consumption metrics, numbers so vast they seemed meaningless at first until I realized they were describing the daily intake requirements of the throne itself. Psychic energy measured in units I had never seen, quantities that would require hundreds of psychers to generate. And beside these numbers, someone had written a single word in red ink, insufficient. I stared at that word for a long time, trying to understand what it implied, and when I cross-referenced the schematic's date stamp with historical records, I discovered it had been compiled less than a century after the Emperor's internment. Even then, the throne was failing. Over the following weeks, I worked through document after document, each one pulling back another layer of carefully maintained deception. I found maintenance logs from the Adeptus Mechanicus detailing repairs to the throne's life support systems, reports that described catastrophic failures and emergency interventions with the clinical detachment of engineers discussing a malfunctioning reactor. I found testimony from tech priests who had witnessed the Emperor's physical state during routine servicing. Descriptions that matched no official account I had ever read. One report filed by a Magos whose name had been redacted described the Emperor's body as being in a state of continuous cellular collapse held together only by the throne's systems and by an unquantifiable psychic force that the Magos compared to a star collapsing inward upon itself. The report concluded with a recommendation that alternative solutions be researched as the current configuration was unsustainable beyond a 2,000-year operational window. That window had closed 8 millennia ago, but it was the testimony of the custodians that truly began to unsettle me. Hidden among technical reports and supply requisitions, I found a series of sealed declarations from members of the Adeptus custodians. Statements recorded shortly before their deaths. Last words preserved in stasis-locked data crystals that required specialized equipment to access. The first testimony I opened was from a custodian named Valder's Seventh Shadow, a warrior who had stood guard over the throne for 3 centuries before his service ended. His words were measured and precise, but beneath the formal language, I detected something like grief. He described watching the Emperor's essence fracture and reform in cycles. Great waves of psychic energy that pulsed through the throne chamber and left the attending tech priests bleeding from their eyes and ears. He described days when the astronomic and flickered and entire sectors of the Imperium were plunged into warp shadow. Moments of crisis when the throne's mechanisms screamed and the air itself seemed to tear. And he described the processions, the endless lines of psychers brought before the throne to be fed into its machinery, their souls consumed to patch the cracks in something that should never have been allowed to break. I worked alone most days, seeing Kaylin only when she arrived to review my progress or deliver additional materials. She never asked what I was finding, never seemed surprised by my growing unease. And when I tried to discuss the implications of what I was reading, she reminded me that my task was analysis, not interpretation. But interpretation was unavoidable. Every document I decrypted painted the same picture. A truth so vast and terrible that I began to understand why it had been buried beneath layers of classification and threat of execution. The Emperor was not enduring. He was not healing. He was not in any meaningful sense alive. What sat upon the Golden Throne was something far stranger and more horrific. A being caught in a state between mortality and godhood, held in perpetual agony by machinery that both sustained and consumed him. And the price of maintaining this state was measured not in centuries or millennia, but in human souls. Thousands upon thousands of psychers sacrificed daily to fuel a system that grew more inefficient with each passing year. The numbers haunted me. I found ledgers from the Adeptus Astrotelepathica detailing the tithe of psychers, records that stretched back 10,000 years in an unbroken chain of requisitions and deliveries. In the early years following the heresy, the daily requirement had been modest, perhaps 50 or 60 psychers fed into the throne's machinery to maintain the Astronomican's light. But the numbers grew steadily century by century until by the current age the tithe exceeded 1,000 souls per day. 1,000 lives every single day just to keep the Imperium's lighthouse burning. And even that was not enough. I found projections from the Mechanicus estimating future requirements. Models that predicted the need would double within 5 centuries, then double again. An exponential curve that terminated in a projection so bleak that whoever compiled it had marked the data crystal with a warning glyph meaning ontological threat. The throne was not preserving the Emperor. It was slowly devouring him, and in doing so it was devouring the Imperium's psychic future one soul at a time. But there was more. Hidden among the testimonies and technical schematics, I found references to something called the Reclamation Protocol, a project initiated by the Inquisition in collaboration with the highest ranks of the Mechanicus and sanctioned by at least 3 of the High Lords. The references were fragmentary, scattered across multiple documents, like pieces of a puzzle. Someone had tried to destroy but could not quite eliminate completely. From what I could reconstruct, the Reclamation Protocol was a contingency plan, a theoretical framework for what might be done if the Emperor's condition deteriorated beyond the throne's capacity to compensate. One memorandum spoke of alternative anchors for the Astronomicon. Another discussed the theoretical possibility of a Gestalt consciousness, a psychic entity constructed from the collective will of trillions. And a third chillingly mentioned the necessity of preparing the populace for a fundamental shift in the nature of imperial worship, a transition that would require careful management and absolute information control. I should have stopped reading. I should have reported what I had found and requested reassignment, claimed the work was beyond my expertise, or that I lacked the proper mental conditioning to handle such material. But I could not stop. Every document I opened revealed another layer of conspiracy, another carefully concealed truth, and I became consumed by the need to understand the full scope of what I had uncovered. I worked through the nights, surviving on stimpaks and recycled rations, and the archive around me began to feel less like a repository of knowledge and more like a tomb, a place where dangerous truths had been buried in the hope they would never be disturbed. The air grew colder as I descended deeper into the classified materials. The lights seemed dimmer, and sometimes in the silence between my own thoughts, I imagined I could hear something breathing in the darkness beyond the chamber's walls, a vast and terrible presence that knew I was there and was waiting to see what I would do with what I had learned. It was Kalina who finally broke my isolation. She arrived one morning as I was reviewing a particularly disturbing testimony from a Sister of Silence who had been present during an emergency intervention when the throne suffered a major failure. The sister's account described the Emperor's psychic scream, a wave of telepathic agony that killed every psyker within 100 meters and left the surviving attendants catatonic for days. Cleen read over my shoulder for a moment, then sat down across from me, her augmentatic eye warring as it focused. She asked if I understood what I was reading, and I told her I thought I did. The Emperor was not immortal. He was imprisoned in a state of perpetual death, maintained by machinery and sacrifice, and the Imperium's greatest lie was that this state represented endurance rather than torture. Colin nodded slowly, and then she told me why I had really been summoned to Terra. The Reclamation Protocol was not theoretical anymore. It was active. The Inquisition, working with elements of the Mechanicus and certain High Lords who understood the true fragility of the Imperium's foundations, had been developing a replacement for the Emperor, a new psychic anchor that could maintain the Astronomicon without requiring the physical presence of a dying demigod. The plan was audacious and horrifying in equal measure. They intended to create a Gestalt entity from the psychic resonance of the entire human species. A collective consciousness forged from trillions of souls across thousands of worlds, bound together through a combination of technology and warp manipulation that pushed the boundaries of what the Mechanicus deemed possible. The Emperor would be allowed to finally die. His millennia of suffering ended, and in his place would rise something new, something that might prove more stable and sustainable. But the transition would require unprecedented coordination, absolute secrecy, and a level of psychic sacrifice that made the current tithe of psychers seem merciful by comparison. The initial activation would consume billions. I stared at Kine as she explained this, searching her face for some indication that she was testing my loyalty or gauging my reaction to deliberate misinformation, but her expression remained flat and professional. She told me that my analysis of the archives had been essential in confirming the feasibility of certain technical aspects, that my work had helped identify critical weaknesses in the throne's infrastructure that could be exploited to facilitate the transition. She told me I should feel proud that I had contributed to perhaps the most important undertaking in the Imperium's history, a project that could ensure humanity's survival for another 10,000 years. And then she told me that my next task was to help prepare the documentation that would justify the Reclamation Protocol to the remaining High Lords who had not yet been briefed. To craft a narrative that would make the unthinkable seem not only necessary but inevitable. I refused. The word left my mouth before I fully understood what I was saying. A simple monosyllable that hung in the air between us like a weapon. I told Colin that I would not participate in a project designed to murder the Emperor and replace him with some untested warp abomination. I told her that what she described was heresy of the highest order, a betrayal of everything the Imperium claimed to stand for. I told her that if the Emperor truly was suffering, the answer was to find a way to heal him, not to kill him and build something else in his place. My voice rose as I spoke, echoing in the vast chamber, and I realized I was shouting. All the weeks of horror and exhaustion and moral revulsion pouring out in a torrent of accusation. Callan listened without interruption, her expression never changing, and when I finally fell silent, she reached into her coat and drew a compact las pistol that gleamed in the dim light. She did not point it at me. She simply held it, letting me see it, and her voice when she spoke was almost gentle. She told me that she understood my reaction, that many of those briefed on the reclamation protocol experienced similar distress, but that ultimately my cooperation was not optional. She explained that everyone involved in the project had been selected not only for their expertise, but for their isolation, their lack of significant personal connections that might complicate necessary operational security. She explained that I had been chosen in part because my family was long dead, my colleagues few and distant, my life dedicated so completely to archival work that my disappearance would barely register. And she explained that if I continued to refuse, I would not simply be dismissed or reassigned. I would be classified as a security risk and eliminated along with everyone else who had worked on the project's initial phases, a purge that would erase all evidence of the reclamation protocol until such time as it was ready for broader implementation. The lights in the chamber flickered once, and somewhere in the distance I heard the hum of machinery changing pitch. Kaylin told me I had 1 hour to reconsider, that she would return and expect my full cooperation. Then she holstered her weapon and walked toward the adamantium door, her footsteps echoing in the silence. I watched her leave, watched the door seal behind her, and then I was alone in the archive with the weight of 10,000 years of terrible truth pressing down on me. I looked at the documents scattered across my workspace. The testimony of custodians and tech priests and psychers who had died maintaining a lie, and I understood that everything I had believed about the Imperium was built on a foundation of suffering so vast it defied comprehension. The Emperor was not a god, preserving humanity through his eternal vigil. He was a corpse being slowly consumed by a machine, and the light that guided humanity through the warp was fueled by daily atrocity. I did not have time to process the full implications of what I had learned. The hour had given me was not mercy. It was procedure, a documented period of reflection meant to demonstrate that coercion had been minimized and that any subsequent cooperation was technically voluntary. But I knew what would happen if I waited. I had read enough inquisitorial protocols to understand how these situations resolved. Compliance meant complicity, refusal meant death, and either way, the truth would remain buried unless someone acted. Unless someone refused to let this knowledge die in the dark. I began gathering documents, not the data cores or crystalline matrices that required specialized equipment to read, but physical copies, parchment, and printouts that I could carry, materials that represented irrefutable proof of what I had discovered. I selected carefully, choosing testimonies that were clear and damning, technical schematics that showed the throne's deteriorating condition, and fragments of the reclamation protocol documents that outlined the Inquisition's intentions. I stuffed them into my coat, layers of forbidden knowledge pressed against my chest, and then I turned toward the secondary exit Kaline had shown me during my first week, a service corridor used by maintenance servitors that connected to the greater catacomb network beneath the palace. The door was locked, but the locking mechanism was old and designed to keep people out rather than in. I forced it open with a prior I found among the archive's maintenance supplies, the metal shrieking as it gave way. And then I was running, stumbling through corridors that had not seen human traffic in centuries. The catacombs beneath the Imperial Palace are older than the Imperium itself. Layers of construction built atop ancient structures that predate Unity. And as I fled through their darkness, I understood that I was descending into Terra's true history. The walls around me bore marks from a dozen eras. Graffiti in languages long extinct. Blast scars from wars that had been forgotten before the Emperor walked. And everywhere the silence pressed close like something living. I navigating by instinct and desperation, following corridors that sloped downward, avoiding the main passages where I might encounter patrols or servitors. And behind me, I heard alarms beginning to sound. Distant at first, but growing closer. They had discovered my escape faster than I had hoped. The purge protocol had begun. I lost track of time in those tunnels. Minutes blurred into hours, and I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to collapse. And still, I pushed forward because stopping meant capture, and capture meant everything I had risked would be erased. I passed through chambers filled with ancient machinery that hummed with unknown purpose, through corridors lined with the desiccated remains of people who had died here long ago, through spaces so vast my handlight could not illuminate their far walls. And gradually I became aware that I was not alone. I heard footsteps behind me, the measured tread of hunters who did not need to hurry because they knew these tunnels far better than I did. I heard voices echoing through the dark, cold, and professional, coordinating their search with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. The Inquisition had sent kill teams after me, specialists in urban elimination, and they were closing the distance with every passing minute. But the catacombs were vast, far larger than I had imagined. And as I descended, I found passages that seemed to defy the laws of geometry, corridors that twisted back on themselves or opened into chambers that should not have been able to exist given the architecture above. I realized I was approaching something, some central structure around which the rest of the palace had been built, and the air grew warmer and heavier with each step. I began to smell that scent again. Ozone and burnt flesh and old blood, stronger now, pervasive. And I understood with a clarity that felt like religious vision that I was descending toward the throne itself. Not the public face of the throne chamber where pilgrims and